This video is going to explain our preventative maintenance procedure. The first thing that we're going to do is to dry prime the system. We need to get all of the liquid out of the tubing so that when we remove and replace it, we won't have any liquid spills on our PCBs or components inside of the instrument. In the GUI software, we can go to the Tools tab and click on the Prime Instrument button. Priming of 10 cycles should be sufficient to get all the liquid out, so we'll do 10 cycles on line 1. And before hitting start, let's make sure to remove the adapter from the line 1 bottle and just leave it hanging out so that it can aspirate air. Once the dry priming cycles are complete, we will exit the software. And turn off the power to the instrument using the power switch in the back. Now we want to remove the top cover and the left side panel. For the top cover, make sure we loosen the corner thumb screws. And also make sure to remove the blower cable before removing the cover. It's also a good idea once the cover is removed to tighten this front left thumb screw to hold the light panel bar. Now we can remove the wash waste bottles and the left side panel. We remove the side panel by taking out the 4 thumb screws on the side. Now we want to remove the fluidics plate. The fluidics plate is this metal plate on the side that holds the waste pump and the fluidics attachments. There are 2 screws on the left and right side to remove. Once the screws are removed, we will need to disconnect all of the cables that are attached to the fluidics PCB here and the waste pump motor. On the fluidics PCB, we have 2 10-pin flat cables to remove on the left and right side. The door lock motor connector, the temperature sensor, the pinch valve, the black and red connector for the light panel, and the orange and black connector for the blower. Okay, and then also the last 10-pin connector for the waste pump motor. Now the fluidics board is free with the exception of some of the tubing attachments here, which we will remove later. The next step is to remove any zip ties that are holding tubing and or cables, and to loosen the lower harness and the upper harness so that we can easily remove and replace all of the tubing. On the lower harness, there will be 2 to 3 zip ties that we need to remove. Locate them and clip them. On the upper harness, there is a zip tie that surrounds the camera cable and the waistline tubing and the harness itself. That needs to be removed. There's also one right inside the bottom part of the harness that is holding the Teflon tubing. That needs to be removed. Around the top of the Z-axis motor, there are a series of 4 zip ties that surround the cables here. Go ahead and remove that. Okay, once the zip ties are removed, we can also loosen the lower and the upper harness. We'll start here at the low end. There are 2 screws that hold the harness to the frame. These screws do not need to be completely removed. They just need to be loosened so that the harness can come off of the frame. Once this harness is removed, we can also detach these cables that are on the back side of the wash pump motor. For the upper harness, we have 1 screw. This one will need to be completely removed. You can take off and hold on to the spacer and set that aside for installation later. Once that's removed, we can also remove these cables from the Z-axis motor and from the front of the Z-axis PCB. This will allow the harness to be fully open so that we can remove all of the tubing. We also need to make sure to remove the 3 zip ties that hold the probe tubing to the Z-axis flex cable. Now we can remove all of the tubing from the system. Before we start, there's 2 pieces that should stay in, and that is the waistline tubing. This is a PVC tubing. It tends to be a little sticky, and so we leave it in to start and then use it to pull the new tubing through. So this tubing we'll leave in, but we will remove all of the other tubing. Start here at the fluidics plate. I'm going to cut the supply line tubing just past this Y connector, just to make it easier to pull this tubing through. Now we can remove all the tubing from the wash pump. Start by removing this thumb screw. this 1x3 supply line tubing through. There is some spiral wrap here that protects the tubing in the harness, so when you're pulling that tubing, you want to try to make sure that stays inside of the harness. Again, I'm going to leave the waistline PVC tubing for now, but I will disconnect it from the straight through connector here. Okay. Now up here we can pull the pinch valve tubing out and disconnect the tubing that's attached to the two ports on the micro syringe. The waistline tubing on the upper harness is attached to the back side of the Z-axis PCB. We can disconnect that. And then this piece of Teflon tubing, you can cut it right above the elbow connector, and that will allow you to pull that piece through the harness. The last tubing that we need to remove is the probe tubing, which connects on the Z-axis board and to the probe itself. We'll go ahead and take off the probe at the same time. We'll remove the 2-wire cable connector, and then we can remove the probe and set the probe aside for installation of the tubing later. Now we're going to remove and replace the macro syringe Teflon tip. First thing we want to do is to remove the cable here that is attached to the motor controller board. What we're going to do is remove this frame that holds the syringe and the motor and the board. There are 3 screws that we need to remove, one here, here, and here. When removing the last screw, make sure we hold on to the assembly. Okay, on the back side there are 2 set screws. There's this large screw here that also acts as a homing switch for the syringe. There's another one that holds the inside of this syringe barrel to this piece. We want to remove that set screw so that we can get easy access to the tip. This screw does not need to be completely removed. You just need to loosen it so that you can take off the plunger tip. Okay. There are 2 more screws on the top of this assembly, here and here that we need to remove. Those two screws hold this top piece of the syringe assembly. Now we can just pull that off. Once we have this off, you can pull the plunger out of the syringe. And this is the part that we're going to replace. To remove the tip from the plunger, take some needle nose pliers, grab onto the end and pry it off. Just want to make sure that there's no little pieces left on the edges of the tip. To put the new tip back on, it's best to place the tip upright on a flat surface. And now we can push down on top, making sure that we cover the ridges of the plunger. It will take a little bit of force. Just want to make sure that the entire tip is covered. Okay, to put the whole thing back together, we'll start with the plunger. Place the plunger in the top here. And then on the back side, you can retighten that small set screw. You do want to make sure this is really tight. The set screw is the only thing that is holding the plunger here to the black plastic piece. Okay, now we can replace the syringe barrel. Just put it right over the top and push down. You're going to slide the barrel down until the two holes for the screws line up with the holes in the black piece. Now we can mount our entire assembly back to the frame. Once your three screws are tight, and remember to replace this cable back onto the motor board connector. Now we're going to replace the small micro syringe Teflon tip. First thing we want to do is to remove this flat cable that's attached to the motor controller board. There are 3 screws on the back that hold the syringe assembly to the frame. One here, here, and here. You need to remove those 3. These screws can be tight, and there is Loctite on the end of them, so it might take a little extra force to get the initial loosen movement. And while removing this last screw, we need to make sure we hold on to the syringe assembly. So we need to remove the large set screw here. This set screw also acts as a homing switch for this switch here. You need to be very careful when removing this screw. If you cross thread while you're removing or putting back in, it won't work properly. So be sure that we make sure that we are level. And it shouldn't require too much force to turn the screw out or back in. Once the set screw is removed, we need to remove the PCB on top with these two by removing these 2 screws. This will give us enough space so that we can now remove the plunger. Now we want to remove that small little white Teflon tip right here. Again, with some needle nose pliers, you can grab the end, twist it off. And make sure there's no little pieces of the tip left on. To replace the tip, it's best to place it on a flat surface with the opening facing up. You want to make sure you push the plunger all the way down. Okay. And we can put the plunger back into the syringe barrel. Now we will put the motor controller board back on using the 2 screws we removed. Now we need to put the set screw back in. To do this, we need to turn this spindle so that it goes all the way down as far as possible on top of the plunger. Once the plunger is covered, you'll want to rotate this piece so that the hole for the set screw is facing here. Now we can replace this set screw. And be very careful when starting to turn. Make sure that we don't cross thread. You may feel a little resistance. There is Loctite at the ends of the screw and inside of the screw hole. Again, we may need to make sure that it is tight enough to hold the plunger on this side. Now we can replace the micro syringe assembly back to the frame using the 3 screws we removed earlier. When you're done there, just make sure to reattach the flat cable back to the motor controller PCB. Now we're going to go through the replacement of all of the tubing. We're going to start with the PVC tubing. This is the tubing that was left in the instrument when we removed everything. This is part number 5190. What you'll want to do is grab one of the straight-through connectors that is provided in the preventative maintenance kit. Now we will replace the waistline for the upper harness. Grab a straight-through connector from the PM kit, and what we'll do is we'll cut just a little bit off of the end of the tubing just to make sure that the connection to the straight-through connector and the new tubing will be secure when we're pulling it through. Put that on one end of the straight-through connector. Take a new piece of the PVC tubing, attach it to the other end of the straight-through connector. Now we can grab the other end of the harness, the tubing at the other end, and start pulling it through. Okay. And remember to keep the connector and throw away the old tubing. Start with the lower harness, attach it to the end here. Take your new piece of PVC tubing, attach it to the other end of the straight-through connector, and then grabbing the other end of the harness, you can pull the tubing through. Make sure you keep the straight-through connector. Okay, now we can replace the rest of the tubing, and we will start with the tubing on the fluidics plate. We'll start with part number 5407. This is the waste pump tubing. Next will be part number 5408. This is a 2x6 piece of tubing. This piece will attach to this waste connector here and this one here. Next will again be part number 5408. These are the 20 millimeter lengths of 5408. These will be attached to the straight through bulkhead connector. Make sure the larger end of the bulkhead connector goes into the tubing. And then attach the other end to the wash adapters. Next is part number 5189. This is a 1.5 by 3 millimeter silicone tubing in lengths of 150 millimeters. We'll attach one to the smaller end of the bulkhead connector. Here you'll need two straight through connectors. These will attach to the ends of this tubing here. And on the other end of those straight through connectors will be the lower pinch valve tubing, part number 6112. These are in lengths of 50 millimeters. You'll want to attach the Y connector to the two ends of the pinch valve tubing. Next, we want to take part number 5189. This is again a 1.5 by 3 millimeter silicone tubing. This is in a length of 660 millimeters. This is going to thread through the lower harness. Remember, this tubing does have a spiral wrap inside. You'll want to try to find that spiral wrap. And then thread the tubing right through the spiral wrap. Now we can attach the waist line and the other end of the 1.5 by 3 piece that we just threaded through the lower harness to the back of the fluidics plate. The waist line will attach to this bottom waist connector. It's a good idea to try to tuck the PVC waste tubing behind the pinch valve. The 1.5 by 3 silicone tubing will go onto the other end of the Y connector. Okay, now before we attach the fluidics plate, let's put the pinch valve tubing into the pinch valve. The number 1 wash connector, which is here, will go through the bottom of the pinch valve. So this piece of tubing will go on the bottom. And the number 2 wash connector here, this piece will go in the top of the pinch valve. I want to make sure to thread the excess tubing we have here back out the other side of the harness so that it's just a straight piece of tubing here into the Y connector into the pinch valve. Now we can reattach the fluidics plate. Make sure we get our waste pump cable attached to the waste pump motor. And then this end will attach to the fluidics PCB. And before I put the other cables on, I'm going to attach the fluidics plate back to the frame. And remember to reattach your orange and black cable for your blower, the red and black cable for the light panel, the pinch valve cable, the temperature sensor, this is the 3-wire cable, the door lock motor. You'll notice there is a orange, red, and brown colored cable, and on the fluidics PCB it is labeled O, R, and B for reference. O for orange, R for red, B for brown. And then the last cable to the fluidics PCB is the 10-pin flat cable. Now that we have all of the tubing through the lower harness, we can reattach this to the frame. And you have 2 screws that will slide that bracket right into the frame and then retighten these two screws. Next, we will add the marprine tubing to the wash pump. This is part 5409. It's a length of 145 millimeters. We also need 2 of these straight-through bulkhead connectors. First thing we'll do is we'll take the large end of the connector and attach it to one end of the marprine tubing. And the same for the other bulkhead connector on the other end. Thread this through our little black bracket that holds the marprine tubing. It's going to face this way. And you can put the tubing into the little gaps here. Place this around the 4 pins of the wash pump motor. Reattach the thumb screw. And then reattach the spring. Okay. These 2 pieces will go inside of these brackets. For now, we're going to leave them loose until we attach the other tubing. And we can take the supply line tubing. This is the 1.5 by 3 that we threaded through the lower harness. This is going to come up and we will attach it to the right side of the wash pump here. Now we can put this tubing, the bulkhead connector should be on top and sit right down into the little bracket. Now we can take part number 5189. It's 1.5 by 3 silicone tubing. This is a length of 60 millimeters. We're going to attach that to a T connector. On the bottom of the T connector, we'll put, again, 5189. It's a 20 millimeter piece. Attach that to the bottom. And then same part number, 5189. This is a 200 millimeter piece. Attach that to the other side of the T connector. The short end will go to the left side of the wash pump. Now set that into the bracket with the bulkhead connector on top. Then the short piece below the T connector will attach to the top of the macro syringe. This piece will leave for now. This will attach to our Teflon tubing, which we will need to thread through the upper harness. The Teflon tubing is part number 6109. It is a 650 millimeter length piece of tubing. Before you thread it, it's best to try to make sure that it's not perfectly straight, but not too bent. So slide it through your fingers to straighten that piece of tubing out. To thread it through the harness, you can start at this end. And I like to put it towards the back of the harness. Okay. Now we need to make the connections on both sides of the Teflon tubing. At the upper end here, you will attach a piece of the 2x6 tubing. This is part number 5408, 20 millimeter length, and an elbow connector. You'll want to put the large end of the elbow into a short piece of tubing. And then you will put the Teflon tubing as far into that tubing as you can. Be very careful to try to push straight. This Teflon tubing will bend and kink very easily. Now, before we attach the tubing and connection on the other end, we need to cut it to length. Easiest way to do that is to first push this as far into the upper harness as you can so that the elbow connector is just sticking out past the end. Now what we'll do is we'll make a cut on the Teflon tubing at a length that it's just inside of this motor. So we'll cut it right here. Now we'll take one of our straight through bulkhead connectors and the 20 millimeter piece of 2x6 tubing. Again, large end of the connector into the tubing. And then on the other end, we'll put the Teflon tubing in as far as we can. Before we add the rest of the tubing to the probe assembly and syringe assembly, we're going to secure some of our connections with zip ties. The first one is this elbow connector with this overlap tubing. We want this again with the elbow just sticking out of the edge of the harness. There are two holes in the middle of this end of the harness. We want to put a zip tie through the top hole. And then there's another hole in the side. And this will secure that piece of tubing right to the edge of the harness. Make sure it's nice and tight. The 2x6 tubing will protect the Teflon tubing, so we can make sure that we're really good and tight here. Okay, next we want to secure our camera cable and our waistline to the harness. Both of these pieces will be pulled up this way, and we're going to put our zip ties right around here. We want to make sure we zip tie as close to this as possible. We don't want to zip tie too far up here. That'll cause too much tension as the assembly moves to the left and right along the x-axis. And before you secure the zip tie too, you want to make sure you have enough length here to attach to the back side of the z-axis PCB. It's okay to pull this out so that there's extra length. You can thread it through later after we've zip tied it. Now we're going to reattach our upper harness using the screw and the spacer. I want to put the screw through the bottom hole in the harness. You might have to move this elbow and tubing out of the way a little bit, and it'll just rest right on top of that screw. The spacer then will go on this side. And then on the bracket here, there are two holes, one on the bottom, one on the top. You want to put this through the top hole and secure it. Now we will attach our upper pinch valve tubing. This is part 6111. And then we'll go into this elbow that was secured to the upper harness. Okay, this will run up and go through the pinch valve. Okay. Now on the right side, we will replace all of the tubing into the micro syringe. This is part number 5406. This is a 170 millimeter piece of silicone tubing. The first place we want to put this is in the back side of the Z-axis PCB. There are two connectors on the back side. The one farthest to the left is a smaller connector. That's what you'll attach this piece of tubing to. You'll thread this through this gap in the frame and loop it around into the bottom part. And this will attach to the front port. There's two ports on the micro syringe. I'm going to attach it to the front port. The pinch valve tubing that you put through the pinch valve will come here. You can thread it under this piece of tubing. On this end, you will attach a straight through connector. And on the other end of the straight through connector is a small piece of the 1x3 tubing. And then this will attach to the back port on the micro syringe. When you're finished, it should look like that. Now we have our waistline tubing. This should thread and sit right in this top part of the frame and attach to the connector on the back side of the PCB that is farthest to the right. Okay. Finished, it should look like that. If there is excess here, you can thread it through your zip tie and then pull on the other end, at the other end of the upper harness, so that there isn't any excess showing out of the end of the harness. Can now reattach our flat cable. This first connector on the top of the Z-axis motor PCB, and then this to the Z-axis PCB. The final pieces for the probe microsyringe assembly are the 280 millimeter pieces of the 1x3 tubing. Start by putting them on the top of the probe. The probe has an aspirate and a dispense needle. We want to make sure that the beveled, angled cut needle is on the right. Can attach the probe here. Make sure we reconnect our black and red wires. And these two pieces of tubing, the one on the left will go on the left side connector on the bottom of the Z-axis PCB. And the piece of tubing on the right will go on the right connector on the Z-axis PCB. Can reattach the flex cable and then to secure this tubing to the flex cable, we'll use 3 zip ties. When zip tying this tubing, you want to make sure that it is tight enough to hold but not too tight to pinch the cable and the tubing. So we'll put one towards the top, another one in the middle, and one more towards the bottom. Okay, the last step is to finish connecting the loose tubing on this side of the macro syringe and wash pump and secure the tubing and cables with some zip ties. So we still have the loose waste tubing. We need one of our straight through connectors, and we'll connect to this end of the waste line that's coming through the upper harness. Okay, this will go underneath the motor and connect to the waistline tubing coming from the lower harness. These pieces will need to be cut. There is extra length, so you want to make sure you have enough so that the assembly can move without too much tension, but not so much that it's loose and could cause problems by hitting something as it's moving. The other connection we have is from this T connector, this 200mm piece. This will need to run underneath here. And we're going to attach it to the Teflon tubing and the bulkhead connector. Okay, final step, we just need to secure the tubing here with some zip ties. We'll do one right at the bottom here at the tubing coming out of the lower harness. With these zip ties, we don't want them too tight. This is really just to keep the tubing together. And we'll do one more right here. Right near these cables. And then one more around this cable here. Just hold that tubing close to the cable. We won't make this one tight. It's just there to prevent it from moving too much. The final step would be to go through the alignment procedure of the reader, the alignment of the instrument, and to do a performance verification. There are separate videos for those.